The grand ballroom of the United Nations headquarters in New York buzzed with the quiet conversations of world leaders. Diplomats in expensive suits moved between groups, their voices creating a symphony of different languages and accents. The annual Global Development Summit had brought together presidents, prime ministers, and heads of state from every corner of the earth. Among them stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, his military uniform a stark contrast to the tailored suits surrounding him. At 34 years old, Traoré was one of the youngest leaders in the room. His presence commanded attention, not because of wealth or years of political experience, but because of something deeper. There was a quiet strength in his posture, a determination in his eyes that spoke of someone who had seen his people suffer and had decided to act. Unlike many of his counterparts who had inherited power through family connections or climbed political ladders for decades, Traoré had emerged from the ranks of his country's military with a simple mission: to serve his people and protect their sovereignty. The evening's main event was a private dinner where world leaders could speak freely, away from the cameras and press. Barack Obama, the former American president, was the evening's keynote speaker. His reputation as an eloquent orator and global statesman made him a sought-after figure at such gatherings. Obama moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his smile warm and his handshakes firm. He had perfected the art of diplomatic conversation over his years in office and continued to wield significant influence on the international stage. As the dinner progressed, conversations naturally turned to Africa's development challenges. Several European leaders discussed their aid packages and development programs with the confidence of those who believed they understood the continent's needs better than Africans themselves. Obama joined one such conversation, where French President Emmanuel Macron was explaining France's continued commitment to its former colonies in West Africa. "The challenge," Obama said, his voice carrying the authority that came with having once been the most powerful man in the world, "is that many African leaders simply lack the sophisticated understanding of global economics and governance needed to lift their nations out of poverty. They often resort to simplistic solutions that ignore the complex realities of international relations." Several heads nodded in agreement. These were men and women who controlled billions in aid money, who decided which African nations would receive support and which would face sanctions. Their perspectives shaped policies that affected millions of lives across the continent. It was then that someone mentioned Burkina Faso's recent political changes. A German minister laughed softly and said, "Speaking of simplistic solutions, have you heard about their new military leader? Traoré, I believe. Another one of these African strongmen who thinks he can solve everything with nationalist rhetoric." Obama's eyebrows raised slightly. He had been briefed about Traoré's rise to power following the coup that had removed the previous government. Like many Western leaders, he viewed military takeovers in Africa through a lens shaped by decades of Cold War politics and post-colonial intervention strategies. "Where is this young revolutionary now?" Obama asked, scanning the room. "I'd be curious to meet him." "Over there, by the African Union delegation," someone pointed toward a group of African leaders engaged in animated discussion. Traoré stood among them, listening more than speaking, his young face serious as he absorbed the perspectives of more experienced leaders like Ghana's president and Kenya's deputy prime minister. Obama excused himself from his current conversation and made his way across the room. As a former president who still commanded global respect, his movement drew attention. Other guests noticed the direction he was heading, and some followed at a discreet distance, sensing that an interesting encounter was about to unfold. The African leaders' conversation paused as Obama approached. Introductions were made, and Obama found himself face to face with Traoré. Up close, the Burkinabe leader appeared even younger, his military decorations simple compared to the elaborate displays worn by some African leaders. There was something in Traoré's eyes, however, that suggested depths beneath his youthful appearance. "Captain Traoré," Obama said, extending his hand with a smile that had charmed millions during his presidency. "I've been hearing about the changes in Burkina Faso. Quite ambitious plans you have for your country." Traoré shook the offered hand firmly. "Former President Obama, it's an honor to meet you." Yes, we have plans. Plans born from the needs of our people, not from the expectations of others. There was something in the way Traoré spoke that caught Obama's attention. It wasn't the deference he expected from a young African leader meeting a former American president. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, a sense that this man had thought deeply about his country's path forward. The conversation that followed would later be recounted in diplomatic circles across the world. Obama, perhaps influenced by the earlier discussion about African leadership, began to probe Traoré's understanding of global economics and international relations. His questions carried an undertone that suggested he viewed the young captain as another well-meaning, but ultimately naive African leader, who would soon discover the harsh realities of governing in the modern world. The challenge with many African leaders, Obama said, his tone taking on the professorial quality that had made his speeches famous, is that they often view international relations through an overly simplified lens. They see everything as a matter of sovereignty versus dependence, without understanding the nuanced partnerships that actually drive development in the modern world. The room had grown quiet. Other conversations had paused as more guests became aware of the exchange taking place between the former American president and the young African leader. The moment felt charged with significance, though nobody yet understood exactly why. Traoré listened carefully to Obama's words, his expression remaining neutral. When Obama finished speaking, a silence settled over their immediate vicinity. The young captain seemed to be weighing his response, considering not just what to say, but how to say it in a way that would convey the depth of his conviction without causing unnecessary offense. What happened next would transform a routine diplomatic encounter into a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Traoré was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful responses come not from those with the most experience, but from those with the clearest vision of truth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré took a moment to look around the room, his eyes taking in the faces of some of the world's most powerful people. Presidents who controlled nuclear weapons, prime ministers who managed trillion-dollar economies, and diplomats who shaped global policy were all watching him. The weight of their expectations hung in the air like a heavy cloud. They expected him to be grateful for Obama's attention, perhaps to ask for advice or assistance, to play the role of the humble African leader seeking guidance from the West. Instead, Traoré's response began quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had seen truth firsthand. Former President Obama, with great respect, I must tell you that your perspective reveals exactly why Africa continues to struggle despite decades of international aid and partnership programs. A murmur rippled through the nearby guests. This was not the response anyone had expected. African leaders, especially young military officers, simply did not challenge Barack Obama in public settings. The former American president's smile remained fixed, but his eyes sharpened with interest and perhaps a hint of surprise. Traoré continued, his voice gaining strength without becoming confrontational. You speak of nuanced partnerships and sophisticated understanding of global economics. But tell me, what nuance exists in a system where my country produces cotton, cocoa, and gold, yet remains among the poorest nations on earth? What sophistication is required to understand that when we mine gold worth billions, but our people cannot afford basic health care, the system is designed to benefit others, not us? The room grew quieter still. These were not the usual diplomatic pleasantries or carefully worded requests for aid. This was something different, something that cut to the heart of relationships that had existed for decades. Obama's expression shifted slightly. As a skilled politician, he recognized when a conversation was taking an unexpected turn. Captain, surely you understand that development is a complex process. Nations cannot simply isolate themselves from global markets and expect prosperity. Integration with international systems, while sometimes challenging, ultimately provides opportunities for growth that isolation cannot offer. Traoré nodded respectfully. You are absolutely right that isolation is not the answer. But neither is the kind of integration that has been offered to Africa for the past 60 years. We have been integrated, yes, but as suppliers of raw materials and consumers of finished products. We have been partners, yes, but as junior partners who are never allowed to graduate to equal status. He paused, and in that silence, something shifted in the room. The African leaders present began to pay closer attention. Here was someone articulating thoughts they had carried for years but rarely expressed so directly in such company. Let me give you a concrete example, Traoré continued. France imports cotton from Burkina Faso, at prices they help set through international commodity markets. This cotton is then processed in French factories, using technology and machinery that Africa is discouraged from developing independently. The finished textiles are then sold back to African markets at prices many times higher than what we received for the raw cotton. At every step of this process, the value creation happens outside Africa, while we provide labor and resources. Obama's diplomatic training kicked in. But surely you recognize that developing industrial capacity requires significant investment, technology transfer, and market access. These partnerships provide exactly those opportunities. The question is whether African leaders are prepared to create the stable, predictable environments that international investors need. There it was. The implication that had been lurking beneath the surface of the conversation finally emerged clearly. The suggestion that Africa's problems stemmed from African failures of leadership and governance, not from systemic issues with international economic relationships. Traoré's response came with the quiet intensity of someone who had thought deeply about these issues not from academic texts or policy papers, but from lived experience. Former President Obama, let me ask you something. When your country was developing its industrial capacity in the 19th century, did it rely on free trade with more advanced economies? Or did it use tariffs, subsidies, and protectionist policies to build its domestic industries? The question hung in the air. Several guests exchanged glances. This was not going according to the usual script of such encounters. Obama paused before responding. Historical circumstances were different then. The global economy has evolved. What worked in the past may not be applicable today. Exactly, Traoré said, his voice gaining a passionate edge while remaining respectful. Historical circumstances were different. When America was building its industries, it had the freedom to protect its domestic markets, to develop its technologies, to make mistakes and learn from them without external interference. When other nations tried to force free trade on America before it was ready, America resisted. He gestured slightly toward the room filled with Western leaders. But when African nations attempt to follow similar development strategies, we are told this is protectionism, this is economic nationalism, this is unsophisticated thinking. We are pressured to open our markets, to accept structural adjustment programs, to prioritize exports over domestic development. The conversation had attracted more attention. Other groups had stopped their discussions to listen. French President Macron appeared particularly uncomfortable, as France's economic relationships with its former African colonies were being indirectly but clearly critiqued. Traoré pressed on, his words flowing with the conviction of someone who had seen the results of these policies in the villages and cities of his own country. You mentioned stable, predictable environments for international investors. But what about stable, predictable benefits for African people? We have provided stability for foreign mining companies for decades. We have maintained predictable export policies, kept our currencies weak to maintain competitive export prices, kept our labor costs low to attract foreign investment. And what has been the result? He paused, looking directly at Obama. The result is that despite 60 years of this sophisticated partnership, despite billions in aid, despite countless international conferences and development programs, most Africans remain poor while the resources from their land continue to enrich others. Obama's response revealed both his skill as a debater and his genuine engagement with the ideas being presented. Captain, you paint a picture of exploitation, but surely you must acknowledge the benefits that international partnership has brought. Infrastructure development, technology transfer, access to global markets, educational exchanges. These are not insignificant contributions to African development. The room waited for Traoré's response. This was the moment when most African leaders would acknowledge the benefits of Western partnership, perhaps criticize specific aspects while accepting the overall framework. This was when diplomatic courtesy would reassert itself, and the conversation would return to safer ground. But Traoré was not most African leaders. Traoré's eyes swept across the assembled faces, taking in the mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and surprise that his words had generated. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that came from representing not just his own thoughts, but the hopes and frustrations of millions who rarely had their voices heard in such gatherings. Former President Obama, you speak of infrastructure development, and I do not deny that roads have been built and hospitals constructed through international partnerships. But let me tell you what I have seen in my own country and across Africa. He paused, ensuring his words would carry maximum impact. Yes, roads have been built, but they connect our minds to our ports, not our villages to our markets. Hospitals have been constructed, but they serve the expatriate communities and urban elites, not the rural poor who make up most of our population. The silence in the room was becoming profound. Even the ambient sounds of the dinner seemed to fade as more guests became aware that something significant was happening. The technology transfer you mention, Traoré continued, his voice growing stronger with each point, consists mainly of training our people to operate equipment we cannot manufacture, maintain, or improve. We become dependent consumers of technology rather than innovators and creators. The educational exchanges send our brightest minds to Western universities, where many remain, contributing to the economies that educated them rather than returning to build our own. Obama's expression showed he was genuinely engaged now, no longer simply making diplomatic conversation, but seriously considering the arguments being presented. But Captain, surely you cannot deny that these partnerships have contributed to improvements in living standards across Africa. Economic growth rates, literacy improvements, reductions in infant mortality. Traoré nodded slowly. You are correct that there have been improvements, and I do not dismiss them. But the question we must ask is, what could have been achieved if Africa had been allowed to develop on its own terms, using its own resources for its own priorities? He gestured toward the group of African leaders who had been listening intently. President Akufo-Addo of Ghana has spoken about this. When Ghana exports cocoa beans worth billions, but cannot afford to import processed chocolate made from those same beans, something is fundamentally wrong with the partnership model. Several African leaders nodded in agreement. This was a conversation they had among themselves many times, but rarely in the presence of Western leaders who controlled aid flows and trade relationships. Let me give you another example, Traoré said, his passion controlled but evident. Burkina Faso sits on significant gold deposits. International mining companies extract this gold using our labor, our water, our electricity. The gold is refined elsewhere, processed elsewhere, sold elsewhere. The profits flow elsewhere. We receive royalty payments that amount to a tiny fraction of the gold's final value. Obama interrupted gently. But surely these operations provide employment, tax revenue, and economic activity that benefits your people. They provide low-wage employment that offers no opportunity for skill development or technological advancement. Traoré replied without hesitation. The tax revenue is minimal because of the generous exemptions we are pressured to provide to attract investment. The economic activity benefits foreign suppliers of equipment and services far more than local communities. He looked directly at Obama. But here is what troubles me most about this arrangement. When we suggest that perhaps we should develop our own gold refining capacity, our own jewelry manufacturing industry, our own mining equipment production, we are told this is unrealistic, that we lack the expertise, that we should focus on our comparative advantages. The phrase comparative advantages seemed to resonate through the room. It was a cornerstone of international economic theory, the justification for the global division of labor that kept developing nations as suppliers of raw materials. Comparative advantage, Traoré repeated, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. This is the sophisticated economic theory that justifies keeping Africa in permanent economic childhood. We have a comparative advantage in digging things out of the ground and growing things in the soil, so we should be satisfied with that role forever. Several Western leaders shifted uncomfortably. These were not the usual complaints about aid, effectiveness, or requests for additional support. This was a fundamental challenge to the entire framework of North-South economic relations. Obama, to his credit, engaged seriously with the argument. Captain, comparative advantage is not about permanent roles. It's about efficiency and specialization that benefits all parties. As economies develop, their comparative advantages evolve. But when do they evolve? Traoré asked, his question cutting through the diplomatic language. Africa has been exporting raw materials to Europe and America for over a century. When exactly does this evolution happen? What are the conditions under which we are allowed to move up the value chain? He continued before Obama could respond. Because every time an African country attempts to develop its own industries, it faces obstacles. Structural adjustment programs that require market liberalization, trade agreements that eliminate tariff protection for infant industries, aid conditions that prioritize export agriculture over food security. The conversation had reached a point where diplomatic niceties were giving way to fundamental questions about global economic justice. Traoré was not merely complaining about specific policies, but challenging the entire philosophical foundation of international development assistance. You mentioned earlier that African leaders need a more sophisticated understanding of international relations, Traoré said, returning to Obama's initial comment. But perhaps the sophistication we need is the ability to recognize when partnership is genuine and when it is simply a more palatable word for exploitation. Obama's response showed both his intelligence and his genuine wrestling with these ideas. Captain, I understand your frustration and I don't dismiss your concerns, but surely you must acknowledge that in an interconnected world, no nation can develop in complete isolation. The question is how to structure international relationships in ways that are more equitable and beneficial for all parties. Exactly, Traoré said, his voice rising slightly with passion. That is precisely the question. But the current answer to that question is that Africa should remain grateful for whatever crumbs fall from the global table, that we should accept our assigned role in the world economy and not aspire to genuine equality. He paused, looking around the room at faces that represented some of the world's most powerful institutions and nations. Former President Obama, you are a brilliant man who has achieved great things, but when you suggest that African leaders lack sophisticated understanding, you reveal a blindness that is common among even the most well-intentioned Western leaders. The room had grown completely still. This was no longer a diplomatic exchange, but something approaching a historical moment, a crystallization of tensions and truths that had been building for decades. Traoré's next words would cut to the heart of everything he had been building toward, challenging not just policies but the fundamental assumptions that shaped how the world's powerful viewed Africa and its potential. The tension in the room was palpable as Traoré prepared to deliver what would become the most memorable part of their exchange. His voice dropped to a more intimate level, drawing everyone closer, making each word carry greater weight. Former President Obama, he began, his tone respectful but unwavering. You speak of our lack of sophisticated understanding, but let me tell you what we understand very clearly. We understand that when France continues to control the currency of 14 African nations through the CFA franc, this is not partnership but monetary colonialism. We understand that when our cocoa farmers receive 2% of the final value of the chocolate sold in European stores, this is not free trade, but organized theft. Obama's expression grew more serious. He was beginning to realize that this young captain possessed not just passion, but a deep analytical understanding of international economics that challenged his own assumptions. We understand, Traoré continued, his voice gaining momentum, that when international financial institutions impose structural adjustment programs that force us to privatize our utilities, liberalize our markets, and reduce social spending, while Western nations maintain massive subsidies for their own farmers and industries, this is not economic wisdom, but hypocrisy. Several European leaders in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable glances. The agricultural subsidies of the European Union and the United States were sensitive topics, rarely discussed so directly in diplomatic settings. But perhaps most importantly, Traoré said, his eyes never leaving Obama's face, we understand that when African leaders who attempt to change these arrangements mysteriously face coups, sanctions, or sudden discovery of human rights violations that require intervention, this is not coincidence but policy. The room grew colder. This was no longer just economic criticism, but a direct challenge to Western foreign policy in Africa. Several diplomats began to look genuinely uncomfortable. Obama maintained his composure, but his response showed he understood the gravity of what was being discussed. "Captain, these are serious allegations. Surely you don't believe that there is some coordinated conspiracy to keep Africa underdeveloped?" Traoré's smile was sad but knowing. "Former President Obama, I don't need to believe in conspiracies when I can simply observe patterns. Every African leader who has attempted to assert genuine economic independence has faced consequences. Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Muammar, Gaddafi. The methods change, but the results remain consistent." The mention of these names sent a chill through the gathering. Lumumba, assassinated shortly after Congolese independence. Sankara, killed in a coup just as his revolutionary programs were showing success. Gaddafi, overthrown in an intervention that left Libya in chaos. Each represented a different approach to African liberation, and each had met a violent end. Thomas Sankara, Traoré continued, his voice growing more passionate, was the president of my country, Burkina Faso, before I was born. In 4 years, he raised literacy rates, reduced infant mortality, planted millions of trees to fight desertification, and made Burkina Faso food self-sufficient. He did this without foreign aid, using our own resources and the labor of our own people. Obama listened intently. He was familiar with Sankara's story, but hearing it recounted in this context, by this young leader who had followed in his footsteps, gave it new weight. Sankara refused to accept that Africa must remain dependent on foreign assistance, Traoré said. He proved that with political will and popular mobilization, African nations could solve their own problems. And for this, he was killed by his best friend, in a coup that brought to power a leader who immediately reversed all his policies and returned Burkina Faso to its role as a compliant client state. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room understood the implications of what Traoré was saying. He was not just recounting history, but explaining his own motivation, his own understanding of the risks he was taking by pursuing policies of genuine independence. Obama's response was carefully measured. "Captain, surely you're not suggesting that every African leader who has faced difficulties was targeted because of their economic policies. Often these leaders faced internal opposition because their methods were authoritarian or their policies were failing." Traoré's eyes flashed with something approaching anger, though his voice remained controlled. Authoritarian? Sankara's government was the most democratic Burkina Faso had ever known. He traveled regularly to villages to hear directly from people. He cut his own salary, sold the government's luxury cars, and flew economy class. Failing policies? In 4 years, he achieved more genuine development than the 30 years of Western-backed governments that followed. He paused, then continued, with devastating precision. "But I understand why this narrative is necessary. If the world acknowledged that Sankara's policies were succeeding, that African nations could develop independently and democratically, it would raise uncomfortable questions about why such leaders consistently meet violent ends while compliant dictators rule for decades with international support." Several African leaders nodded subtly. This was a conversation that needed to happen but rarely did in such forums. Obama, displaying the intellectual honesty that had made him a respected global figure, engaged directly with the argument. "Captain, even if we accept your interpretation of these historical events, what is your alternative? How do you propose that African nations develop without international partnerships?" Traoré's response revealed the depth of thought he had given to these questions. The same way every other region of the world developed, former President Obama, through protection of domestic industries, investment in education and technology, retention of resource wealth for national development, and gradual integration with global markets from a position of strength rather than dependency. He gestured toward the assembled world leaders. This is how America developed in the 19th century. This is how Japan developed after World War II. This is how South Korea and China developed in recent decades. But when Africa attempts to follow similar paths, we are told this is impossible, unrealistic, contrary to modern economic principles. Obama leaned forward slightly, his engagement with the idea is evident. But Captain, the global economy today is fundamentally different from previous eras. The level of interconnection, the speed of technological change, the complexity of supply chains, all of these factors make the kind of independent development you describe much more challenging. More challenging, yes, Traoré agreed, but not impossible. What makes it impossible is not economic reality, but political reality. The global economy is structured to prevent African development, and this structure is maintained through institutions, agreements, and when necessary, force. His next words would bring the conversation to its climactic moment, a statement that would crystallize everything he had been building toward and leave the room in stunned silence. Traoré took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either establish him as a serious thinker on the global stage or mark him as another radical African leader to be marginalized by international opinion. The room seemed to hold its breath as he prepared to deliver what would become his most quoted statement. "Former President Obama," he said, his voice clear and steady, "you suggest that we African leaders lack sophisticated understanding of global economics and governance. But let me propose a different interpretation. Perhaps what we lack is not sophistication, but the willingness to accept sophisticated explanations for simple injustices." Obama's eyebrows raised slightly. This was not the direction he had expected. The conversation to take, Traoré continued, his words flowing with the power of long-suppressed truth. "The sophisticated explanation is that global markets are complex, that development requires patient cooperation with international partners, that African nations must accept their current role while gradually building capacity for greater participation in the world economy. The simple reality is that this system was designed to extract wealth from Africa and transfer it elsewhere, and it continues to function exactly as designed." He paused, looking directly into Obama's eyes. "So when you say we lack sophisticated understanding, what you really mean is that we are not sufficiently willing to accept our own exploitation with a smile and express gratitude for the opportunity to participate in our own impoverishment." The silence that followed was absolute. Diplomats who had attended thousands of international gatherings had never heard anything quite like this. The young African captain had not merely challenged specific policies, but had stripped away the entire intellectual framework that justified the global economic order. Obama, to his credit, did not retreat into diplomatic platitudes. Instead, he engaged with the fundamental challenge Traoré had presented. "Captain, that is a very serious accusation. You're essentially arguing that the entire international development system is deliberately designed to maintain African poverty." I'm not arguing it," Traoré replied calmly. "I am observing it. After 60 years of development aid, Africa remains the poorest continent despite being the richest in natural resources. After decades of structural adjustment, African economies remain dependent on raw material exports. After countless partnership agreements, African people remain marginalized in the global economy they help sustain." He gestured around the room. "If this system were designed to develop Africa, former President Obama, would these not be considered catastrophic failures requiring fundamental changes in approach? Instead, they are treated as temporary setbacks requiring more patience, more aid, more partnerships of the same kind." Several African leaders began to nod more openly. The president of Senegal leaned forward, clearly engaged with what he was hearing. The Kenyan deputy prime minister had stopped pretending to look at his phone and was listening intently. Obama's response revealed both his intellectual rigor and his genuine struggle with these ideas. "Captain, surely development is more complex than simply a matter of design. There are historical factors, geographic challenges, institutional weaknesses, and yes, sometimes poor leadership that contribute to Africa's development challenges." Traoré smiled, but it was not a happy expression. Former President Obama, you have just demonstrated exactly what I mean by sophisticated explanations for simple injustices. Yes, there are historical factors. The primary one being centuries of slavery followed by colonialism followed by neo-colonialism. Yes, there are institutional weaknesses, primarily because African institutions that attempt to serve African interests are systematically undermined. His voice grew stronger. And yes, there has been poor leadership. But interestingly, the poor leaders who serve Western interests remain in power for decades with international support, while good leaders who prioritize their people's welfare face constant pressure and often violent removal. The room had become completely still. Even the serving staff had stopped moving, sensing the historical significance of the moment unfolding before them. Traoré's next words cut to the heart of everything he had been building toward. But let me tell you what truly reveals the sophisticated nature of the system, former President Obama. It has convinced many Africans themselves that their poverty is their own fault, that their dependence is natural, that their leaders are inherently corrupt and incompetent. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The most sophisticated aspect of modern colonialism is that it has made its victims apologize for resisting it. When we demand control over our resources, we are called unrealistic. When we insist on developing our industries, we are called protectionist. When we refuse unfair trade agreements, we are called isolationist. And when we succeed despite these obstacles, we become security threats requiring intervention. Obama's expression showed he was genuinely wrestling with these ideas. As someone who had devoted much of his post-presidency to development work, he was confronting fundamental challenges to his worldview. Captain, even accepting some of your criticisms, what is your practical alternative? How do you propose to change a global system that has evolved over centuries? Traoré's response revealed not just his analysis of the problem, but his vision for the solution. The same way every oppressive system in history has been changed, former President Obama, through the organized resistance of those who suffer under it and the moral awakening of those who benefit from it. He looked around the room, his gaze taking in faces from every continent. Africa must unite not just in rhetoric but in practice. We must coordinate our resource policies, develop joint industrial strategies, create alternative financial systems, and support each other against external pressure. We must stop competing for Western approval and start cooperating for African development. Several African leaders exchanged meaningful glances. This was not just analysis but a call to action, a blueprint for continental transformation. But equally important, Traoré continued, people of conscience everywhere must recognize that African poverty is not a natural disaster requiring charity, but an artificial condition requiring justice. The same moral clarity that ended slavery and formal colonialism must be applied to economic colonialism. Obama leaned back slightly, clearly processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. This was not the usual diplomatic discourse, but something approaching a manifesto, delivered with the passion of someone who had seen his people suffer and the intelligence of someone who understood exactly why. The conversation had reached a climactic moment, but Traoré was not finished. His final words would transform this encounter from a memorable diplomatic exchange into a moment that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. The weight of expectation hung in the air as Traoré prepared to conclude what had become far more than a diplomatic conversation. Every person in the immediate vicinity understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment when decades of carefully maintained diplomatic fiction had been stripped away to reveal fundamental truths about global power and African agency. Obama, perhaps sensing that this young leader was about to deliver something definitive, made one final attempt to steer the conversation toward more conventional ground. Captain Traoré, your passion is evident, and your concerns deserve serious consideration. But surely you must acknowledge that change happens gradually, through patient work within existing systems, building trust and demonstrating responsible leadership. Traoré's eyes lit up with something that combined frustration, determination, and profound understanding. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight not just of his own convictions, but of centuries of African struggle for dignity and self-determination. Former President Obama, he said, his words measured but powerful. You have just perfectly illustrated the sophisticated trap that keeps Africa subordinated. Patient work within existing systems means accepting systems designed for our exploitation. Building trust means proving ourselves worthy to those who profit from our poverty. Demonstrating responsible leadership means showing that we can be trusted to manage our own oppression effectively. The room had grown so quiet that the sound of someone setting down a glass seemed to echo. Traoré's words were cutting through layers of diplomatic convention to expose raw truths that everyone present understood but rarely acknowledged. He continued, his voice growing in strength and clarity. But let me tell you what responsible African leadership actually looks like, and why it terrifies those who benefit from our current position. Responsible African leadership means putting African people first, African resources first, African development first. It means saying no to agreements that benefit others at our expense regardless of the consequences. Obama's expression had grown increasingly serious. He was no longer engaging in routine diplomatic conversation, but confronting ideas that challenged fundamental assumptions about global governance and development. You want to know about sophisticated understanding? Traoré asked, his question rhetorical but piercing. Here is what we understand with perfect sophistication. Every minute that passes, every day that we accept the current system, African wealth continues to flow outward, while African poverty deepens. Every partnership agreement we sign that prioritizes foreign interests over our own people's needs is a betrayal of our responsibility as leaders. He paused, looking around the room at faces that represented some of the world's most powerful institutions. We understand that patience is a luxury that hungry children cannot afford. We understand that gradual change often means permanent subordination. And we understand that sometimes, moral leadership requires the courage to be called unreasonable by those who benefit from immoral systems. Several African leaders had moved closer to the conversation. The president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, nodded almost imperceptibly. The South African representative leaned forward with visible interest. Something was crystallizing in the room, a sense that long-suppressed thoughts were finally being articulated with the clarity they deserved. Obama, demonstrating the intellectual honesty that had characterized his career, asked a direct question. Captain, if you reject gradual reform and patient cooperation, what exactly are you proposing? Revolution? Isolation? A complete break with the international community? Traoré's response revealed the depth and sophistication of his thinking. Former President Obama, I am proposing that Africa finally act like the wealthy, powerful continent that it actually is, rather than the poor, helpless victim it has been convinced to pretend to be. His words carried the force of revelation. We have 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 60% of its arable land, the youngest and fastest growing population, and energy resources that could power the entire globe. We are not poor. We are not helpless. We have simply been convinced to act as if we are. The implications of this statement rippled through the room. If Africa truly understood and acted upon its strengths, rather than accepting its assigned weaknesses, the global balance of power would shift dramatically. I am proposing, Traoré continued, that we stop asking permission to develop our own resources, stop seeking approval to prioritize our own people, stop apologizing for demanding fair prices for our wealth. I am proposing that we coordinate our policies, support our allies, and present the world with a united Africa that negotiates as an equal rather than begging as a subordinate. Obama's next question cut to the heart of practical concerns. And, if the international community responds with sanctions, isolation, or other pressures, how do you propose to withstand that? Traoré's smile was confident but not arrogant. The same way every other region that achieved independence withstood such pressures, former President Obama, through unity, determination, and the recognition that short-term sacrifice is worth long-term freedom. He gestured toward his fellow African leaders. Africa feeds the world, powers the world's industries, provides the minerals for the world's technology. The international community needs us far more than we need their permission to prosper. What they cannot afford is for us to realize this and act accordingly. The conversation had reached a moment of crystalline clarity. Everything that had been building throughout their exchange was coming together in a vision of African agency that was both radical and entirely logical. Obama, perhaps recognizing the historical significance of the moment, asked one final question. Captain, you began by challenging my suggestion that African leaders lack sophisticated understanding. After everything you've said, how would you characterize the understanding that African leaders actually need? Traoré's response would become the most quoted line from their entire exchange, a statement that would be remembered long after the diplomatic pleasantries were forgotten. Former President Obama, he said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of absolute truth. The understanding we need is not how to better explain our poverty to those who profit from it, but how to better explain our wealth to ourselves. We are not a poor continent seeking help. We are a rich continent that has been robbed, and our most sophisticated understanding must be of how to stop the robbery and reclaim what is ours. The silence that followed was profound and complete. In that moment, everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, the articulation of a vision of African independence that was both intellectually rigorous and morally compelling. Obama extended his hand, and when Traoré shook it, the gesture carried weight beyond mere diplomatic courtesy. Captain, Obama said, his voice showing genuine respect, you have given me much to think about. As the evening continued and conversations resumed their normal diplomatic rhythms, word of the exchange spread quickly through the gathering. By the next morning, clips and quotes from the conversation were circulating on social media across Africa and beyond. Young Africans shared Traoré's words with excitement and hope, while international media struggled to process what they had witnessed. The encounter had transformed both men. Obama left with a deeper understanding of African perspectives on global economics, while Traoré had established himself not just as a revolutionary leader, but as a sophisticated thinker capable of articulating a coherent alternative to the current global order. In the months that followed, Traoré's words would inspire a new generation of African leaders and activists. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the most powerful response to condescension is not anger but clarity, not defensiveness, but truth delivered with unwavering conviction. The room had been silenced not by confrontation, but by the undeniable logic of justice spoken by a young leader who understood that sometimes the most sophisticated response to complex problems is to insist on simple truths.